Welcome to Myth Informed. I'm your host, Brian Edward, and sitting to my left is the man, Sean Fraser.
Well, thanks, Brian.
Also known as co-host. Today, we have with us a guest that I've really been looking forward to talking to for a while because I cannot talk to her on Twitter. Meghan Murphy. Meghan Murphy is a Canadian writer and journalist, founder and editor of the website and blog Feminist Current. She also vlogs on a YouTube channel under her own name. That's Meghan Murphy. Meghan completed a master's degree in the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at Simon Fraser University in 2012. She's skeptical of rigid ideologies and stresses the need for critical thinking when advancing arguments. Welcome, Meghan.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Oh, no problem.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming. And we'll talk about, you're going to be at the event in New Jersey, which we'll talk about a little later. So awesome to have you.
Yeah. So you're going to panel. So we'll definitely see you on Labor Day. And initially, we've come out of the atheism world, but we're now talking, our primary mission is a viewpoint diversity and maximizing viewpoint diversity to limit the effects of authoritarianism. But speaking, which sometimes still encompasses religion, depending on what's going on. And speaking of religion, you were accused of heresy recently, and which got you banned from Twitter. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, so I disagreed with, and I have been disagreeing with for some time, the what I consider to be kind of cultish ideology behind trans activism. So the idea that there's some kind of innate gender identity that exists within us, that biological sex is not a material reality, but is a social construct. So there's been this weird switch where now it's gender identity that's the material reality, and it's biology that's the social construct. The idea that men can become women and vice versa, and that it's not okay to disagree with or question these ideas at all.
Right. And I think specifically the tweet itself, and correct me if I'm wrong, was, but men aren't women, though. Is that right?
There was, well, my account was shut down a few times before I was banned permanently. And one of the tweets I was shut down for was men aren't women, though. And the other one was, I think, something like, what's the difference between a trans woman and a man? So what I was getting at with that question was, what turns a man into a trans woman? How do you define even a trans woman? What is that? Part of my big problem with this ideology is that I find the terms are so vague. We're all supposed to accept them unquestioningly, but they don't really have any cohesive definition. And then the final tweet I was banned for was when I referred to a male as he. And this is a male who, well, first of all, this is a male, you may have heard of him, who was going around asking female estheticians to give him a Brazilian bikini wax. Did you hear about this?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah. And when they declined, he took them to human rights court. And he was still at that time going by his male name on social media, and in some places a female name as well as his male name. But on Twitter, for example, at that time, he had his male name and then in brackets a female name. So he wasn't even, going by a female name. He wasn't identifying, as far as anyone knew, as a woman. And I referred to him as he, and then was permanently banned for life.
Right, because that, I think they would say it's targeting, right?
Yeah, I mean, they were obviously kind of combing through my account and looking for reasons to ban me because, I didn't say anything that was offensive. I wasn't harassing anybody. Twitter said publicly that, or at least implied that I was harassing trans people, but I wasn't at all. And I mean, all of my tweets are on record. They're all in these court documents. Nothing I said was hateful. Nothing I said was violent. I mean, it was totally ridiculous.
And if it's not about a specific person, right? Like the last one, okay, maybe there were, you could say it was about a specific person, but the first two, to me, sounded very much in general. So someone could say, well, I think you're full of shit, but you're giving your opinion, and you're so I just don't understand.
Yeah, that was a general opinion. That wasn't about any person. And the last tweet, I mean, literally the only words in the tweet, it said, yeah, it's him. I wasn't, following this person around the internet saying mean things to him or anything like that. That was the first time I'd put his handle in a tweet. So
Well, and obviously we stand against that type of censorship. We're all about free speech and not getting banned for words. But I just want to back up a little bit. So catch me up on some of this. Just pretend I know nothing, because I really don't about anything. So you were saying, right now we don't have a good definition for like what is a trans woman. And I agree. I think there's a lot of changes that our society is going through that we're still navigating and trying to figure out. I think our culture in the West is definitely better off than some in the Middle East or, very conservative religious areas of the world. So Mike, I guess my question to you is, do you feel that trans women, do you not agree that there are trans people?
I don't agree with the idea of transgenderism. So I don't agree. Again, I don't agree that it's not possible to change sex, even if you take hormones, even if you get surgeries. I mean, you can sort of alter your body parts, but you can't actually change your chromosomes. Right? You can't literally change sex. So trans is it's based on a feeling. So it's like, I mean, it can be a number of things, but one of the things apparently is that, if you feel like you don't fit within gender stereotypes. So say if you're a man and you feel like you don't fit perfectly within everything that masculinity is meant to be, then
Sure.
that could mean that you're trans. But to me, that's just having a personality. It just means that you have like some preferences, or you like certain things, or maybe you don't like wearing pants and you like wearing dresses, but that doesn't mean anything. It just means you don't like wearing pants, you like wearing dresses. It's just a variety of feelings and personalities that different people have. I mean, another way to define it is through what's referred to as gender dysphoria, which I see as being, maybe more accurately described as body dysmorphia. So you think you have the wrong body parts, or you hate your body parts and you want different body parts. And I mean, I guess that could be a mental condition, like a mental illness. But again, transgenderism can mean so many different things, and it could be anything. Like right now I could say, actually, I'm a man, actually I'm transgender, and you would have to accept that. But what does that mean? Like, what's changed within me that's making me transgender?
So do you think, are there people that are born feeling a different way? Do you think that is an actual thing? Do you think somebody actually comes out and can say, yeah, I was born a man, or I feel like more like a woman, or people tell me I should be gay or straight, but I actually am gay? Do you think that there is that like reality for some?
Sure. Again, I think that would be a kind of mental illness. Like if you were born feeling like you were literally born in the wrong body, and you hated your genitals or whatever it is, or when you're going through puberty, you are obsessed with the idea of removing your breasts, then that could be a form of mental illness. But I don't think that makes you a different sex or a different gender or anything like that. I mean, it's just something that you feel. And for lots of kids, teenagers or whatever, who experience gender dysphoria, they come out of it, right? Like a few years later, they accept their bodies as they are. And there's lots of reasons that a person might feel gender dysphoria. Like going through puberty is hard. It's hard for girls who are suddenly being objectified by grown men, right? Like it makes total sense to me that you might hit puberty and hate what's happening to your body, whether you're a boy or a girl. But it seems to be happening a lot more to girls currently in any case. Like they get their periods and they start growing hips and they start growing breasts and they start being treated differently. And so, yeah, I mean, yeah, you might really hate your body and wish that you had a boy's body, or wish that you could have your pre-puberty body or whatever.
So you it sounds like a definitional problem. I mean, I get the point of, females should be defined as maybe those with XX chromosomes, or even some will say those who produce large gametes that have cytoplasm but aren't mobile. Like, is your problem like a definitional one?
Can you break that into one?
Well, I mean, like men produce sperm, right? Sperm are mobile,
sure,
and they don't have the cytoplasmic material to do this. An egg does. I mean, but if you look at it, because you have to make male and female, not only for humans, but then you have to push it out through the animal kingdom, and even plants also follow this model.
So you're looking for a definition of male and female? Is that where you're?
But yeah, I'm saying is your problem with this definitional? Because isn't gay and straight more of a feeling? It would be hard to kind of pin that down other than self-reporting that
Well, gay and straight is based on sex, right? So, so a lesbian, for example, is a woman or a female who's attracted to and wants to partner with other females. So I think there is kind of a material basis for that in terms of definitions. Whereas transgender or gender identity, I feel like there is no material definition. There's no kind of line, like who are we putting in this category and on what basis?
I do agree that it's really hard to create a definitional a definition for transgender. I've tried to do it myself, and it's hard.
Yeah, and well, I guess my thing is when I look at the experience of people, we all kind of grew up in the 90s, and we kind of saw how a lot of the changes that are happening today. Like we have different challenges today, but we had very big challenges in the 90s when we're talking about same-sex couples, even biracial couples in certain areas of the country, or and the as far as like the trans community, like that really in the 90s, the late 80s and 90s, that's when it really started kind of coming up and people started first finding out about it. And I guess it's hard for me to look at someone like in a very conservative community, like the Hispanic community or the Black community, that they come out as trans. They literally get shunned by their family. They're homeless. They're in LA, there are a lot of spots in the US where a lot of trans people actually live together, just homeless, completely desolate, and with no support systems. And it's hard for me to sit there and say, well, I don't believe that these people think the way they identifies the way they are going through these types of challenges. And so that for me, like that, when I look at those types of struggles, like I see something powerful there. I see something that people, they truly identify that way, And
by the same token, there's a ton of like really privileged white middle class, upper class college kids who are announcing that they're non-binary and everyone has to refer to them as they, or dudes who are like these 25-year-old assholes who are announcing that they're women and that women have to kind of bow down to them and are shouting over women and threatening women with violence and trying to shut down our events and literally perpetrating violence on women and defending it on the basis that they're actually women and that these women are hateful because they disagree with their ideology. I'm not saying that trans-identified people don't suffer. I mean, of course, lots of trans-identified people are discriminated against and harassed and do suffer, and I do think that's wrong. It's not that, of course, I don't want people to be discriminated against or harassed because of how they look or how they want to dress or how they want to live their lives. I want people to live their lives in ways that feel authentic and fulfilling and, feel right and true to them. But I don't agree that in order to do that, it's necessary to say that it's literally possible to change sex and that a man is literally a female because he doesn't identify with masculine stereotypes.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, and, a lot of these things boil down to the individual. And I totally hear what you're saying as far as certain people may be using it as an advantage or using it, when you get into activism, whether it's feminist activism or atheist activism or whatever your passion is, you will get people that weaponize things unfairly. And we've seen it many times across various activist circles. So yeah, there definitely are those players that are not, they're not telling the truth, or they're bad actors.
But what would the truth be? I mean, how do you determine who believes what?
And that, for me, I honestly, if someone wants to say they're non-binary, that's their thing. My whole thing growing up in the 90s was kind of live and let live. I consider myself a feminist growing up, meaning that I want to see men and women and everyone treated equal, equality, all the races, everyone just being treated like who they are. Everyone has personalities and characteristics. And so I always kind of looked at it like, if, yeah, I know there's assholes. There's Chinese assholes. There's black assholes. There's white assholes. There's bi assholes. There's people that are assholes, but I'm a firm believer most people are good, and they want what's best for themselves and their family in a lot of cases. So I kind of meet them where they're at, you know?
Well, I mean, I agree with you that I do think that most people are well intentioned in terms of their beliefs and their politics and whatever. And I would probably say live and let live if this weren't, being implemented into like policy and legislation. Like it's different when you start creating laws around it, and when, what's been happening is that trans activists have started to go after women-only spaces. So places like transition houses, for example, where women are going to escape male violence, and their funding is being threatened. And to me, that's really serious. And things like men being transferred into women's prisons and men being allowed to access women's change room. Like, live and let live. Sure, live and let live in your own house. Like, feel how you want to feel, dress how you want to dress. But when it starts hurting other people, then we have to have a conversation about that. Or even when it starts impacting other people, we need to have a conversation about that.
Yeah.
So what's your biggest concerns then? Like you talk a lot about women's only spaces like being threatened. Like where do you think the biggest potential impact of that is? And do you think that that's already happening, or you fear the consequence of legislation to open like a loophole?
Well, men are already being transferred into female prisons in Canada. It's happened in the UK. And there's been violence perpetrated by those men against women. There's been sexual assaults that have happened as a result. Men are basically allowed to access women and girls' change rooms if they want to, if they declare themselves women. Here in Vancouver, local transition house, Vancouver Rape Relief. So they're Canada's longest standing rape crisis center and transition house. Their funding is under attack because they don't allow men to access the facility or to volunteer in the facility. So this is, again, somewhere where women are going who've been severely abused to escape violence and to be safe and to heal from that violence. And local trans activists here in Vancouver got a $30,000 grant pulled because of their women-only policy. So these spaces are under attack, and there are real impacts. There's women who've had to leave shelters because they've been forced to share a room with a man and they feel unsafe.
Well, I did have a question. Okay, so we brought up some safe spaces for women, prison being one of them. The prison one's interesting to me. Obviously, you probably have the facts on this, and I'd love to hear kind of what's been occurring. But I really haven't. So if there is a trans woman, let's say it's someone that's transitioned, that actually has done the surgeries and gone through that, putting them in a male prison would be like I can't. The core issue with male prisons is raping. Instead of, like that's one of the things in the prison system that I can't believe has never been addressed. I mean, these guys are constantly getting jumped, getting raped. I mean, just having terrible things happen to them. Now I understand most of them are criminals, but the system isn't perfect. There are innocent people in there too. And the kind of what they have to go through. I mean, just could you imagine if there was a transition woman that was put in a male prison?
What happens in prisons is disgusting and awful, and I don't care if they're criminals or not. I don't think that people deserve to be raped and abused. But I guess, the issue is I don't support men being raped and abused and being beaten up in prison, but I don't think that we should put women at risk to resolve that. And the reality of these policies right now is that it has nothing to do with surgery. The reason that women and feminists are kind of speaking out about this is because all these policies are being implemented and these laws are being changed based on self-identification, not based on any surgeries. So you don't have to have gone through any kind of process to declare yourself a woman if you're a man, and then have access to these spaces. So
kind of having a more streamlined process of, this is how we know someone has transitioned, this is how they live their life, versus they got arrested for armed robbery. Okay, now today I'm a woman and put me.
Well, yeah, but would there be like, if they said, okay, we're going to do this, like, could you define a line of like, transitioned enough, that you would change your mind?
I personally wouldn't draw that line. I don't think that it necessarily makes sense to say that because, again, I don't believe that it's possible to change sex. So I don't believe that because a man gets breast implants, that makes him female. Um, I mean, I think that we could have that conversation if that's what these laws were based on, but they're not. So if these laws were saying, you know, like, okay, a person has to have all of the surgery from top to bottom, they have to have been on hormones for a certain amount of years, blah blah blah, then we could have a conversation about those impacts. But I honestly, I don't know that that would make a massive I don't know that I would be totally comfortable with saying, well, in order to literally be a woman and to count as a woman, you have to have had these surgeries, because I don't think that's true either. But of course, the main problem is that, like, these men who have penises are allowed to enter into change rooms with like women and girls and be naked in there, and you know, just regular males are allowed to say from 1 minute to the next, I'm a woman and I should be allowed access to these spaces. Um, and yeah, and we're not allowed to challenge that without being called, you know, Nazis and fascists and transphobes and hateful and so on and so forth.
Yeah, which I definitely don't agree. I mean, everything should be up for debate, and I think that again, you know, that's part of the challenges we have in this decade and in the new generation are these ones. You know, like having these conversations are important.
And going back to like what you were saying, like I can see a certain amount of sympathy for kind of the battered women's shelter, right? And that, you know, a woman that does not feel comfortable around men, especially at that time, right? I certainly can sympathize with that. But you could have then, what do you do with, say, the trans woman that's also been beat up, probably by men? Where do we put that person? I mean, can you put them in like a different area of the show? How would you solve that problem?
Well, I don't know why. I mean, I think that there should be spaces and services specific to trans identified people. And so, and feminists would for sure support that, and help fundraise and whatever. But that's not what's being advocated. Like, this is the weird thing, is that to me, it seems like all of trans activism is about attacking women's spaces that already exist instead of trying to build something up. So I'm always asking, you know, why are you not spending your time and energy trying to create these spaces and to try to create these services? That's what women had to do. I mean, women built transition houses themselves during the second wave feminist movement. You know, during the 70s, they funded them themselves. They volunteered at these places, and they made sure that they kept running all these years. And it was just a lot of hard work and a lot of volunteer work and a lot of fighting for funding. And now, you know, decades and decades and decades later, these activists are going after these spaces. And I'm kind of saying, you know, build your own spaces. And I know that some people see that as being as something kind of like mean, but it's not. If they're saying they need spaces and services, then we should work to create those spaces and services. We should ensure there's access to gender neutral toilets and change rooms and whatever, if that's what's needed. But that doesn't mean that we should get rid of the single sex spaces as well.
You can make an argument for that. I mean, I can see it. Do you think like why this is coming around? Are we as like the Western people now identity crazed? Because I was reading an argument, I think it was like Dr. Claire Jones like tweeted this out, but it was like a gender critical feminist versus and a trans activist talking, and she was saying that you have the identity cis in trans, right? The trans identifies as a woman, right? But that also then to say that you or I are cis means that we strongly identify with our own gender. But I was hearing some lesbians say, but I don't. What makes me female is because I'm female. I don't feel particularly female.
Exactly. I mean, to feminists, like, we see cis as, I mean, again, I see it as sort of an unnecessary word, but also as like a word that we don't identify with. So lots of women will say, well, I don't identify with femininity. There's lots of things about me that aren't feminine, you know, like I'm not passive, I'm not docile, I'm not, you know, like I don't love stilettos and pantyhose, and some women like wearing makeup and some women don't. And, you know, and yeah, a lot of lesbians I know will say, you know, I never identified with any of these feminine stereotypes, and I identified more strongly with masculinity, but that doesn't change your sex. And so to impose that cis label on all women just because they don't identify as trans implies that we do love femininity and we do feel like an affinity towards, or we do identify with all of those roles and stereotypes. And it's just not true. Again, we're just female because we're female. We're women because we're female. That's the only definition that there is, and that's the only definition we really need. I mean, a woman is an adult human female. I don't think that we need anything beyond that.
No, it's a good point. I worry about like the identity crisis, because there's certain races that have a stronger racial identity, right? I've talked to Black people all the time, and there is a Black racial identity that I think conveys some benefits, but also has some detractions, right? The benefits are like some kind of purpose, and the detractors are a certain conformity. But then I think that we're also identity crazed, that they're wanting to put identities on white people, and then the main one is ally, that you feel like you have to identify that I'm white, but I'm an ally, so I'm a good white. This stuff drives me insane. I mean, am I right that this is all coming from this identity craze, or do you see it differently?
I mean, I find the word ally a bit annoying also. I just see it as kind of virtue signaling, like, right? Like, it's like announcing that you have good politics versus bad politics. And like you said, it's like, I'm a good guy. And so I find it quite irritating and fake. I mean, I do think that we're kind of obsessed with identity and tribalism in a way that's not necessarily helpful. But I particularly think that these identities that we're seeing now, especially among younger people, are so much about kind of feeling special and almost like fetishizing marginalization and oppression. So it's like, I want to be marginalized too. Like, I want attention. Like, I want suffering. And it's so weird to me. It's like, why would you want to be marginalized? Like, why would you want to suffer? And it's like, sort of to justify your voice. And that's a problem that we've sort of created in our culture, where only certain people are allowed to speak about something. And in order to speak about something, you have to have an identity. So, to speak about transgenderism, you have to identify as trans, or to speak about feminism, you have to be a woman, or to speak about, prostitution, you have to identify as a sex worker. And it's totally, I mean, it's intellectually unproductive, and I think that it's not helpful in terms of having intelligent, public debate, and in terms of critical thinking. Like, I don't think that you have to identify with whatever it is that you're talking about in order to talk about it. I think that's ridiculous.
Yeah. It seems like victims are getting a certain amount of moral superiority by being victims, but victims can also be abusers. Just because you were abused doesn't mean that you're not abusing someone else.
Or just because you're part of an oppressed population or you've suffered, that doesn't mean that you can't also cause the suffering of somebody else. Or it doesn't mean that you get to just act however you want, or, be shitty to other people, and we see that in these kinds of communities. I see it, I mean, because I pay attention to this issue particularly. Maybe you have other examples, but I see it in trans activism, where people who are trans activists or who identify as transgender get to say really horrific things to other people and aren't held accountable for it, or get to behave in really awful ways and aren't held accountable for it because they have right politics and we have wrong politics.
I do agree with that.
Or because we're oppressive because we're cis people. So we have to sit down and shut up and take the abuse. Like,
right.
And we are starting to say, I mean, and that's it kind of boils down to what I was saying before with like activists. You have certain activists that are really good. They're passionate about what they're doing. They're actually making changes. They're building things. They're creating things for people that are positive. But anytime you see an activist that says, this is my name and you need to remember me and blah, 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 it's a bad actor. When they're doing, the fake outrage. I've seen it so many times, people that try and climb to the top of these organizations, whatever industry it's in, and they're beating their chest all the way up top, to the top. I mean, and those are the people that will use those tactics of outrage and kind of use the tactics of those they're criticizing. I mean, it's kind of disgusting.
But I agree. It does seem to be disproportionately policed on Twitter. I mean, I did see. Well, yeah, I did see ones where there was a gender critical feminists, right? The slang for that is TERF, or it's more of a pejorative, meaning trans exclusionary radical feminists. But a number of trans activists surrounded a woman and her newborn and said, "Get the baby away from the TERF." And I thought, okay, wow, you're yelling and surrounding and bullying a woman that has an infant because you don't like her position. Okay, well then why aren't those people booted? You know, like how can that be celebrated when you get kicked off? You're right, that standard is wrong.
Yeah. Why are these people getting away with threatening violence and with actual harassment? You know, like I've been threatened with violence on Twitter lots of times. Lots of women have, lots of people have said, you know, like literally advocated violence against people, and they don't get forced to leave Twitter. It's totally ideological, or it's, you know, like in my case, I think it was that I had a pretty big following. And so I was sort of gaining what Twitter trans activists perceived as some kind of power. Like I was making it okay to ask these questions and to talk about these things. And they didn't want these conversations to be happening and these questions to be answered. So they just wanted to find some excuse to get rid of me.
Yeah, well, and I do that. I've also seen like turf graves are transgender bathrooms. I mean, that's pretty gross.
Yeah,
and you know, where's the banning? So I certainly think this is worth the debate. Heck, I don't even know where I am on the debate, right? But I certainly want to hear both sides.
Correct.
And, you know, and I do kind of see one side getting punished. And what's weird is though, like, where we might disagree too, and I've heard you say a couple times kind of class oppression for women specifically, like isn't the same thing when we're talking about this, like isn't it all men, like that men or women need to be kind of away from men, and that male violence, and then the patriarchy, like the patriarchy to me seems sort of like God, like is it even real?
I think, I mean, I don't want to be away from all men, so I disagree with that position. I'm not a separatist. I like men. I have lots of male friends. I'm heterosexual. I'm interested in being around men. And I mean, I will say in the past, you know, year or so, I've sort of started to rethink my own discourse and my own, and the things that I've been saying with regard to feminism all along that I sort of started to realize are knee-jerky things also. So I'm sort of trying to think more carefully about words like misogyny and patriarchy and things that we as feminists kind of just repeat over and over and over and over again without questioning. And it's tough because I think even in, you know, like I've been part of the feminist movement for a long time, and I will continue to be a part of the feminist movement, but I do see sort of a similar kind of shutting down of certain ideas and questions within the feminist movement also that I'm sort of hoping that we can push past. You know, like I am a person who really wants to have conversations with people that I disagree with, or people who I wouldn't have wanted to talk to in the past, people who have different perspectives than me, or people who just have perspectives that have been labeled whatever. People are labeled all sorts of stupid things. You know, people are labeled like alt-right for, I don't know, I don't even know what alt-right means anymore, because the people that I've seen labeled alt-right or labeled racist or labeled sexist even, and I'm like, no, they just are not, they're not towing the line. Like they're not saying the right things, or they're asking questions about those right things that you're supposed to say. And it's really frustrating to me to be seeing, you know, people that I'm allied with doing that. But, you know, certainly we see this on the left, which is a big part of the reason why I've sort of been like, okay, I'm done with the left, partly because I feel like the left's politics have just become cultish. Like it's about repeating these mantras, and there's only one right thing you can say. And the way that I see the left behaving towards anyone they disagree with is gross. Like I saw all these protesters going after a Trump supporter. I don't know if you saw that video on Twitter recently.
Yeah, I believe I did. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was just like horrified. Like I was like, you guys are like abusing some dude because he has different politics than you. And I think Trump is awful. I think Trump is a horrible person. But that's not how you treat people. And certainly that's not how you change people's minds. I mean, what on earth are they hoping to achieve by treating people like that, who they believe that they disagree with. And honestly, like, so much of the time, I don't even think these people know what they're disagreeing with. Like, it's, people who hate me don't know what they hate about me.
Exactly.
They have no idea what my positions are for the most part. They won't talk to me about my positions, and I see them online saying how horrible I am and how mean I am and I hate trans people and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, do you even know what it is you're angry about? Do you have any idea who I am or what I think? And, if you had a conversation with me, you probably wouldn't be able to say all these things about me online anymore, but you refuse to even have the conversation, which is used sort of as an excuse to continue to hate me or whoever it is. I mean, that's applicable in all sorts of different scenarios.
Well, I think that was really cool that, you mentioned that you are changing some of your positions. You're thinking, or you're at least thinking in different lenses. And that's one of the conversations we're having in New Jersey is how do you admit when you're wrong? It's essentially going to be a panel of, how do you change your opinion? How do you change your mind? And because a lot of online personalities get stuck in my audience expects this. I have to keep saying this. I have to keep saying this, or I lose my audience. And so it's a tricky thing. So it's really cool to hear you say that. But yeah, I mean, just I forgot where I was going now, Brian. I totally forgot.
Well, I think is,
but that's awesome to see.
I can't for sure, Sean, say exactly where you were going.
Where was
I'm not in your head. I don't know how your argument identifies there.
Yeah.
But what I think too is it intersectionality seems to kind of like grab everything that it's not necessarily even about feminism, right? Let's forget about like the transgender portion. Then is feminism racial enough? Do we have enough feminists of color? Do we have,
But I wasn't even saying that. I was going back to her point, more of the violence. That was the interesting thing. So like him or hate him, I was actually in the UK with Sargon. And it was interesting because you had to hit a bunch of protesters on the left that were literally, throwing milkshakes. Okay, people laugh that off. But, you could put stuff in milkshakes. That could be deadly.
Well, and it's also not funny because it's scary. Like, it's like if I'm going to an event and I'm worried that somebody's going to huck something at my face, like, it's not okay. I don't care if it's a milkshake. And so then it's like cute. Like, it's not cute. Like,
exactly, but it was more in the milkshake. Like what wasn't covered was the amount of people that literally charged. They charged them. They were trying to throw punches at him. They're trying to tackle him. Like the whole time I was there for the week, I did 3 events with them, and the whole time, and it's like him or hate him. Like, how is this
right? And if Tories did that to Jess Phillips,
right?
Holy shit, that would be national.
How does this represent? See, I was on the left too, and we had MythCon 4. It was kind of like a breaking point for me because all of a sudden, it's like guilt by association. We're bringing these people that other people hate, so now we're white nationalists, even though I'm half Mexican, and like, just all this stuff. I mean, I had people going after my job. They're emailing, directors at my job, trying to get me fired from my job, and so I had all kinds of weird, awkward conversations with my employers. But it's like, when did we start justifying those types of actions? Violence, going after people's jobs. I mean, this is not a liberal thing. Liberal is supposed to be progressive, turn the other cheek, like move forward. Let's talk these things out.
And the left has really taken that up, that thing where like it's okay to be violent against fascists. But all that means is that anybody you label a fascist or anybody whose politics you label as harmful, then you're justified in perpetrating violence against them. And like I think I saw on Twitter people accusing me, like I can still see Twitter just because I can't participate, right? Accusing me of being like alt-right or like a white nationalist or something like that, just for coming to this conference. I was like, sorry for wanting to have conversations with people, like some of whom I might agree with on some things and some of whom I probably disagree with about a lot of things. Like, but this guilt by association thing, it's like, you can't even have a conversation with people you disagree with. And again, I don't know how you think, like, if your aim is to change society or have like a political impact, I don't know how you're going to do that if you don't talk to your detractors or don't talk to people who don't already agree with everything you think.
Well, you can the other option is you can force it down their throats.
Well, the interesting
that's
thing,
the authoritarian option.
Yeah, that's if you're a dictator, then sure, do that. Like,
I'll make this last point. I don't hear this made a lot, but if you take that to the extreme, if you take it all the way up, and if that truly is your case, we should have violence against those we don't agree with or are fascists. these are liberals now literally advocating for war because we don't agree with China's policies in certain areas or Russia's policies in certain areas. That means we can't have conversations. Let's just start nuking them. I mean, that's essentially, what the end.
Get rid of them.
Is. Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. It's more of a civil war, but I don't like the idea of words are violence, and that because you hold exposition, it automatically, we know by history that this leads to violence. Like that's a specious claim at best. So
I didn't mean to cut you off. Sorry.
It bugs me. But what I was going to say is, does intersectionality kind of grab it? Because it seems like that it will take any issue. You could take, just regular feminism and say that this isn't colored enough. You can take anything and make, you don't have enough disabled people. You don't have enough poor people. You could divide it up by class. It seems like we always have to look at an intersectional lens at every problem. And that seems wrong to me.
Well, and it's weird in a lot of ways because it sort of assumes that because a person is part of a particular group, they think in a certain way. So it assumes that, like all people of color agree or whatever.
Right.
I mean, the funniest thing that I think about the term intersectionality is that people just use it as like a way to, in the same way that they use the term ally, right? It's like, I'm intersectional, I'm an intersectional feminist. And it's like, oh, okay, like you're not being intersectional enough. And it's like, what are you saying? Like, what is it? Like it doesn't necessarily have any real basis in a person's politics or perspectives or anything. It's just a word that people use, again, to virtue signal. But yeah, I mean, I think it can really easily slide into tokenism, which I also don't think is really helpful. I think diversity and representation is important. I don't think that, organizations should be manned by only white men. I think it's important to have people from different, with different experiences who come from different places, and to sort of encourage and enable and help people who have been marginalized or who haven't had the same access to certain jobs or to education or to money or whatever, to, like help those people move forward and not just allow the people who are already there to stay there. But yeah, like I think it sort of turns into, again, this sort of silencing thing and this sort of right to attack anybody who's part of a privileged group. And again, it's like, well, you're a white man, so you can't talk. And that irritates me. It's like, well, just because he's a white man doesn't mean that he doesn't have a valuable perspective. Maybe he has a really shitty perspective.
Right,
but,
right.
If we look at this through that intersectional lens, right, regardless of the colors and sexes in the room, everybody's thinking the same intersectional way. We have no diversity of thought, even though we have wonderful diversity of everything else. Yeah. And does that help your company?
Well, my guess is no. And I'll give you an example, and I can't name any names in this because they'd kill me. But my company is actually German. So we have German facility, we have a United States facility, we have Chinese facility, Puerto Rico. So it's interesting kind of being amongst like those conversations and seeing how the different cultures clash. And you do get different ideas out of different cultures. It's interesting. But as far as the intersectionality stuff goes, I know someone who started their own company. She's a CEO. She's hired 7 women to work for the company. There's I think 2 guys, 7 women, mostly women, and they work with a government body, and the government body has come in and said, you are not diverse enough of an organization for us to work with. I mean, growing up, if
racially,
I would have,
right?
Well, because racially, but also just not diverse in general enough. This is a CEO that's a woman who started a very successful organization, very successful company, multi-million-dollar company, not diverse enough. I mean, that sounds like growing up, that sounds crazy to me. Like when
it seems like that, but yeah, in the late 80s, that would have been a celebration of women's achievement.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a bit odd. And a bit nitpicky, right? Like,
and scary. It's like the largest account available for this company that's saying you're not diverse enough, so we're not going to give you our business. Scary.
But what about like the oppressor-oppressed lens? Do you still like see that? Because it seems like some of the critique of radical feminism is they're always seeing it through maybe not an intersectional lens, but they're always seeing it through an oppressor oppressed lens, like especially as it relates to, say, sex work? Like, what are your views there? Do you always use that lens, or do you put sex work in a different category?
Well, maybe, what do you mean
I
exactly
guess
as it
that's two
applies to?
questions. Like, one, when you look at like feminism and women maybe as an oppressed class,
Empowerment.
are you looking? Is that, do you feel like the radical feminist lens is the same sort of like oppressed oppressor lens, but slightly different than intersectionality, but yet similar in an oppressor oppressed lens?
I mean, I don't think that all men have power over all women, if that's what you mean. I do think that most men are in a position of power. And when we're talking about things like prostitution or sexual assault or domestic abuse or something like that, I mean, there is the reality that men, for the most part, are stronger than women and are able to overpower women, no matter how much that woman works out. So women are in a vulnerable position. And I do think that there is some level of socialization that plays into the situation with prostitution. I mean, I think that prostitution is a particularly disgusting industry where a lot of abuse happens, a lot of women are killed, a lot of women are abused. That's an industry where there's an excess of very vulnerable, very marginalized women, you know, the poorest of the poor, women who are drug addicted, women who have a long history of being sexually abused from the time they were kids and are sort of funneled into prostitution. And the fact that there's so many men out there that are taking advantage of that really upsets me and grosses me out and makes me wonder what it is about men that think that, not all men see prostitutes, but a lot of men do, and why it is that they don't think about the humanity of those women and why they think that it's okay to go and pay a woman who's poor and vulnerable and who's been abused and who has no other option to perform whatever act he wants her to, just because, you know, he wants to get off.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, there's
what about,
so many nuances.
I can
that.
certainly see it. Like if you're talking about like the kind of the street, like the hooker, right, where you have like, you know, you have a lot of drug addiction there, you have like a lot of seedy stuff going on, pimps, lots of abuse.
Yeah.
You can't report it to police. But take it like in like the Nevada legal brothels, where everything seems to be above board, and by all means some of the successful women in these places are very upper middle class.
I don't think there's a lot of very upper middle class women who are working in legal prostitution. I think for the most part, it's still women who don't really have many other options, because the reality is, as much as, you know, sex work advocates would tell us otherwise, is that most women don't aspire to have sex with a dozen strangers every day of their lives. Yeah. Like most women aren't interested in having sex with men that they aren't interested in. And if they're interested in those men, then they're just going to have sex with them. Like if you think about, like, as a woman, you know, like if I'm attracted to a man and desire him and want to have sex with him, then I'm not going to ask him for payment. True. You know, you ask for payment because you don't want to do it.
But most women are attracted to men, right? But then there's a certain, say, 5% of women that are lesbians. Like what if say 5% of women like do choose this? They just kind of look at things very differently.
I mean, if women choose prostitution, they can do that. There's no shortage of men who are going to buy sex. They're not out of a job ever. You know what I mean? Right. Yeah. But the vast majority of women in prostitution don't want to be there. That's not their ideal situation. They're there because they don't have any other option for survival, or because, you know, they're in an abusive relationship with their boyfriend and he's pimping her out, or because they have a pimp, or, you know, because they've been trafficked. You know, in Europe, there's lots of places where prostitution is legal. But it's not, you know, like in Germany, prostitution is legal, but it's not German women who are in prostitution. It's not German women in the brothels. It's the poor women who are being brought in from elsewhere, who have no other options to make a living and have to escape wherever they are because they can't make a living here. And they're, you know, stuck in these rooms day in, day out, having sex with these strange men, right? Like if it were really something that women were volunteering to do or really wanting to do, that wouldn't be the situation.
Yeah. And it's even weirder too. In the UK, they did legalize sex work, and now there's actually an argument against this because they legalize sex work, but it has to be independent. So if you're a man or a woman or whatever and you're engaged in sex work, you can only be the proprietor of it. So you can't hire a bodyguard or have anybody support you. Like, you just have to, it has to be just you. Anyone else can get arrested, which is interesting. And you can get in a lot of trouble if you have like protection or people, you know, whatever the case is. So that's weird. What about the porn industry? Because I've seen a lot of female actresses, porn actresses come out and say how empowered the industry actually has become. There's more women directors now more than ever. You know, this is something that they can make a lot of money. They can get a lot of success out of it. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, porn is one of the only industries, and prostitution also, where as you gain more experience, you also have less, you're less valuable in the industry. So I think that says a lot about the industry. They really kind of value fresh meat, right? It's not something that's sustainable. It's not something that women last a long time in, you know, like that's a real, like most women in porn only last a few months and then they're out because they either don't want to be there, they can't take it, or they're pressured to do more and more and more extreme stuff, right?
Well, but that's actually, I actually saw a documentary on this where they had these leading women directors, and they actually said, yeah, you're right in the sense of like being, as far as being in the films, like, you know, it's like being a running back in the NFL is a short career. But they actually do move up to becoming directors. They own their own studios, and they actually have a lot more women that want to work with them because
it's a feminist industry.
What's that?
It's a feminist industry.
Well, it's more, you know, they feel more comfortable, like the actresses or actors feel more comfortable working with a woman because, you know they've been there, they've done it. That, you know,
I think most of these companies are still owned by men, and most of the directors are still men. Like that's true that there's probably more women making porn now than there were in the past. But I mean, if you think about the big companies, you know, Pornhub and stuff like that, those kinds of places are owned by men, and still most of these films are directed by men, and most of what's produced is aimed at a male audience still. And so regardless of the fact that, you know, maybe there's some women in porn who are enjoying themselves or working for female directors and, you know, aren't being abused or whatever, have autonomy in that industry, I still think that for the vast majority of women in that industry, that's not the case. And I think that the vast majority of what's produced in pornography really still is like quite dehumanizing and often violent, and, you know, very often misogynist and often racist, and women are being called all sorts of misogynist names while they're being, you know, whatever. I'm not going to describe specific porn scenarios, but, you know, and there's a lot of like incest fantasies and stepfather and daughter and all of that stuff. And I think, I mean, in general, I think that pornography is not a great thing for humanity and for people's sexual relationships. I don't think that it inspires a lot of empathy. I don't think that it teaches men good practices in the bedroom. I don't think that it's great for men who are having sex with real human women and who are overusing porn and have become accustomed to masturbating to certain, you know, very extreme graphic stuff and can't get off with a regular human partner.
Yeah.
So,
well, you know,
that's
I
a little bit on the men too. Remember the alcohol industry, you can get addicted. Is it Jack Daniel's fault if you become a drunk?
Yeah. Well, and I would agree too, you know, as far as like the hardcore stuff, for whatever reason, yeah, you're probably right. It's more of a male dominated audience, although there are women that enjoy it too. But, you know, when you talk about shows like Sex and the City or Outlander, things like that, I mean, more of the 50 Shades of Grey, I mean, women love that stuff. And yeah, it's not the hardcore stuff that you find on whatever website, but, you know, it's still very sexual, very sexualized. And, you know, growing up, again, that was one of the things we confronted was women's sexuality, because for a long time, women have been seen as the repressed. If you enjoy sex, you're a slut, this and that. And, you know, women do enjoy sex. And so they can enjoy these types of industries.
well,
I think they do it in a different way.
yeah, I mean, I'm not against sex and sexuality, and I really like Sex in the City. But I think that pornography, I think there's a difference between pornography and enjoying sex, or even, you know, liking naked bodies. And I think that, again, I mean, I think there's so much violence and so much abuse and you know, the sexualizing of violence and the sexualization of these kind of like, there's a lot of humiliation that happens in pornography too, where it seems to me like the goal is to humiliate the woman, again, to dehumanize her, you know, and yeah, we can say it's not all like that, it's not all like that, but it sure is a lot of it.
Yeah, I mean, we could go down like a rabbit hole, and you know,
and we disagree with that treatment of women too, by the way. So you know, I mean, that's
I'm
outrageous. I think most people.
I think that you're right, and that there's certain parts that I'm sure I would find distasteful, but there are people that fetishize humiliation, both men and women. So you could have that, you know, but it sounds like what you're saying is if you could, that at some point, if there's a consent line, if you believe that these women are consenting, then it sounds like you're okay with it. Your concern is there's a lot of people being taken advantage of.
Well, I mean, regardless of whether people consent, I mean, the imagery, I think, can be harmful also, right? So if the woman in the video consents and is fine, that doesn't necessarily mean that the imagery that's being produced isn't, you know, encouraging degradation or isn't sexualizing violence or isn't having an impact on the people watching. So there's two things, right? There's the people on this side of the camera, the people who are being watched, and there's also the people who are watching, and that their sexuality is being shaped, and what they desire or what they think is sexy is being impacted, and that but in turn impacts their partners and how they treat their partners and the kind of sex they want to have with their partners and stuff. So I think there are kind of wide-ranging consequences or implications.
That's a good point. And yeah, we'll kind of put a bow on that topic there, because you'll be talking more about this on the panel at the New Jersey Minds events, which is called Not Safe for Work. So check that out. And then I want to get to a super chat here by ABK, who says, do you feel modern feminism is losing its way from classic feminism, and that's caused much of the confusion?
Well, I guess, I mean, I would argue that third wave feminism, so I guess that's what we could call modern feminism. That's the kind of feminism that kind of popped up in the 90s and that is still predominant today. I think that third wave feminism has veered way off path in terms of what women were doing during the second wave. And it's not to say that there aren't women who are still doing, who aren't still, you know, carrying that torch and, you know, again, fighting actual violence against women and focusing on things like domestic abuse and focusing on things like pornography and like prostitution, whereas third wave feminism seems to have veered off into the superficial and into, you know, a real big focus on transgenderism and personal identity and validating personal identities and, you know, repeating mantras that I disagree with, but that aren't to be questioned. You know, sex work is work, trans women are women, things like that. And I think a lot of it is quite centered on young women who want to, you know, view everything as potentially empowering. So any choice they make is a feminist choice, and nobody's allowed to contest that because they made a choice. And I feel good about it. My lipstick's empowering, you know, like my porn is empowering, my like S&M, BDSM is empowering, my high heels are empowering, my burlesque is empowering. Like, I like it, I like it, I like it, I like it. Like, it's just this super like narcissistic kind of childish version of politics.
Okay.
Well, the interesting one is my hijab is empowering.
Oh God.
Right, like that kind of thing too. That's it's, you know, some people, I've talked about it before as choice feminism. Yeah. Well, I choose it, so everybody shut up.
Yeah,
that's like pretty anti-intellectual.
Conservative woman could say the same thing, right?
Yeah, well, I think too, you know, like one of the things that I find very disappointing with the loud, obnoxious actors on Twitter and social media is they're constantly focused on the West, the US, we're terrible at this, we're terrible at this. And you don't see Iraq or Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia or India even, or China. I mean, we're not talking about the real human rights violations that are going on and the real oppression of women in those areas. I mean,
maybe the most severe.
Yeah, well, exactly. But you know, you're not seeing people say, hey, donate to my cause of this person, donate to. There was an author in China. She was jailed for 30 years because she wrote a book that featured one sex scene She was jailed for 30 years. They had a guy that raped somebody that was jailed for 5 years, raped a child, 13-year-old, jailed for 5 years. She was jailed for 30 years for a sex scene that she wrote in a book. So, there's real challenges out there that I think I'm not seeing covered.
So I guess, yeah, the question is what like are feminists failing, like, outside of the West?
Are feminists failing outside of the
Like,
West?
are Western feminists like are they missing the boat on talking about things that are happening, say, outside of our country?
Oh, I see. I think a lot of feminists are, not all feminists, but yeah, I mean, I don't see these third wave feminists talking about things like female genital mutilation, for example.
Yes.
And because of this kind of you're only allowed to talk about your own experience thing, it's meant that they've been prevented from talking about oppression that's happening in other countries because they can only talk about themselves. They're not allowed to speak about other people's experiences. They're only allowed to speak about their experience. Otherwise, they're, I don't know, co-opting other people's narratives or however they would say it, right?
Yeah.
So that kind of fetishization of your own experience and that you can't speak to anybody who doesn't share your identity has really prevented that conversation from happening and those critiques from happening.
I think that's part of it, but I think ultimately the reality of it is it's not trendy. It's not in vogue. It's not in vogue to talk about Saudi Arabia. We're not, if we had these women marches, there are giant events around this, you would see these people start to transition. But because it's not a popular thing, that's why they're not touching it. And unfortunately, activism is spending a lot of time and hard work on things that people may or may not see when you're actually doing actual activism. It's a lot of work for, something that you're not necessarily getting noticed.
Well, maybe, or Meghan, is it intersectionality that I can't, as like, so if I'm a feminist, I can't talk about Saudi Arabian women because I'm not Muslim or brown.
Yeah, well, that's the point I was trying to make before, is that it's like you're white, so you're only allowed to talk about your experience as a white woman living in the US or living in Canada or whatever, and you're not allowed, under third wave doctrine, you're not allowed to talk about Muslim women.
Yeah.
And
or even like, say, black women in the Congo, right, which is the rape capital of the world, and I don't think that's primarily Muslim either, right? I mean, those are African Christians.
Yeah, and I mean, I think part of the problem is also this always makes me feel like an old person when I say this, but part of the problem is social media. Like, it's that so much of this activism is happening online, so it's naturally about virtue signaling and gaining points. So it has much less to do with what you're doing on the ground, what you're doing in real life, as opposed to what you're saying on Twitter or on Facebook that's getting likes from your friends and retweets, because this weird, like, vapid statement that doesn't do anything or doesn't mean anything is the popular thing that you're supposed to say, and everybody's supposed to retweet it and everyone's supposed to support it and nobody questions it, and we all just continue to virtue signal online and don't really do anything.
Yeah. And I guess I'll make my last point on this too. One thing I've noticed, another thing is ignorance. A lot of these activists, they actually haven't gone and traveled the world. They actually haven't gone into the areas where, you see actual oppression. I mean, when I was in Egypt, we had many guides trying to cover my wife's head, telling her she looks pretty in it and this and that. And she told every single one of them, no, fuck off, But it takes, actually experiencing those cultures. By the time we got back, I mean, my wife was just livid at the way she was treated out there. But I mean, it was just constant things that we wouldn't see here. But if you actually don't experience it, I think that ignorance plays into it. And so, all they're reading is their Twitter feed, and that's what gets them outraged. So,
well, yeah, and I mean, you're not learning about the history of the women's movement. You're not learning women's history in gender studies, for example. So if you are like a college kid and you're in gender studies, you're learning a lot of theory that just isn't applicable to real women or real people in real life. And you're not talking about real things. You're talking about, like, subverting heteronormativity and all this, like, stuff that is only applicable to other people who are in gender studies.
That's right.
Yeah, and there's other feminists to purple, like El Hamania is absolutely fantastic, right? It seems like there are feminists, Asra Nomani, even Yasmin Mohammed. There's many that could be promoted, and it seems like there's a failure
Correct.
even to do that. But I wanted to really thank again ABK for that awesome super chat. Like, but when she mentions, I'll tie it up. I want to get your opinion on this. Maybe ABK can answer, and you too, Meghan. What is classic feminism? Is that Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin, or is that Camille Paglia and Christina Hoff Sommers?
Well, I've never used the term classical feminism, so I'm not sure what it is that she's talking about. It's a she who asked this question?
I don't know.
Oh, okay. They? Hopefully I
ABK,
didn't misgender anyone. So I talk about, second wave feminism versus third wave feminism, or sometimes I talk about radical feminism versus third wave feminism. So I'm not sure exactly what they mean by classic feminism. But in terms of radical feminism and second wave feminism, yeah, we're talking about people like Andrea Dworkin, Catherine McKinnon, women like Sheila Jeffries, and Robin Morgan, and I guess it's hard for me to answer the question, so I'm not sure.
Dworkin seems crazy, like, just to be honest. Like,
crazy?
Yeah. I read some of her stuff and I'm like, it's just like, I mean, she's like a good writer and it's like this massive drama, but it's like assertion after assertion, like penetrative sex is akin to violence. It's a little wild.
Well, I don't think she actually said that penetrative sex is akin to violence. I know that's repeated over and over and over again, but I think she was talking more broadly about the situation of men who are in positions of power and how they how women experience sex with men when men have power over them in our culture. And I don't think she's crazy. I think she's a good writer. I think she experienced a lot of trauma in her life and that she was passionate.
Well, Meghan, thank you so much for coming on. Go to her Patreon, support her Patreon. And you also had another fund for the lawsuit.
For the Twitter lawsuit. Yeah, so I'll send you that link for that because we do need people to still donate to support that lawsuit because it's ongoing and these lawyer fees and whatnot are extremely expensive. So, and my entire lawsuit's being funded based on donations. So
yeah,
I would appreciate support in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. Check that. Support her there. Also, too, screw Twitter. Go on Minds. Meghan's on Minds. And Minds is funding this entire event to have these conversations come together in real life. We got to get off of social media. We got to get out of the outrage bubble and have these important conversations. So, again, Meghan, we truly an honor for us to have you on and to have you at the event. Brad, did you have something?
No, I just wanted to say, yeah, thanks. It's really fun to like be able to talk again.
Yes.
We agree on some things, but disagree on others. What I appreciate the most is you willing to listen and share and vice versa. And that I can learn from. Like, even if we don't disagree, I can learn and maybe change my mind. So
yeah, I really appreciate that too. I mean, I really enjoy having conversations with all sorts of people, and I've enjoyed talking with you, and I'm really excited. I appreciate being invited to the conference. I'm really looking forward to meeting everyone and having these discussions, and I'm really glad that it's happening.
Yeah, and use code Meghan to save 10% on tickets. I don't want to forget that.
And spell that right. It does have an H in it.
Yes.
I mean, GHAN.
That's right.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Good night.